I think it's no problem.
Okay, so maybe I'll take 5 minutes and just quickly sort of introduce the sort of Rutgers, as the Rutgers is a consortium, but some of the things that we've been working on to give people a sense for the conversations that we've been having. So I will quickly share very briefly okay, there we go. All right. Yeah, so anyways, we wanted to, so we have this event and within it, we've had a sort of conversation within it that's linked to the Global Consortium on Bigotry and Hate. And I should say that Professor Engel's a member of that. And thank you very much for giving us a voice here. And it speaks to some of what we're doing. So this is an international partnership involving 9 different institutions from all over the world, 5 different continents. We have a website. We're going to have a new one and a Twitter handle. If you're interested, please do check in with that. The idea, the first conference began at Rutgers, and that was sort of the initial framing, but involved, of course, all of the different participants. And the idea of the initiative was to look at manifestations of hate in a variety of different localities and to try and understand different local responses to these dynamics and the ways that they have particularities, as well as dynamics that intersect transnationally and globally as well. So as you can see on the poster, we were, like everyone, this was impacted by the pandemic. We were actually supposed to finish up a little bit earlier, so we've had to shift, delay, and move things around. So if you look at the poster on the right, you can see South Africa 2021 because of the pandemic. That's going to be shifted to 2022. We do have a convening that will take place next month in Moscow. Anyways, we have a number of other upcoming meetings in the future. But they're sort of within this broad initiative. Right now we'll have a final conference at Rutgers in 2024, assuming the pandemic continues to abate in different parts across the world. There are different sort of sub-initiatives besides the convenings that take place. So each convening is educational in the sense that they sort of raise awareness about what's going on locally. The participants present sometimes within that. Each is sort of catered to the local context. But in addition, there are different educational collaborations going on. There's a journal, Global Voices, that will have content related to what's been transpiring. We'll have a final edited volume. And this rethinking pieces from a previous initiative, but we'll have a rethinking hate. And then we have participant research, and I've been doing that. And throughout the session here, right, the involvement of participants from the consortium in this conference has brought insights in different ways. It's been sprinkled throughout the program, but the different state of hate presentations are something that we've been doing during the pandemic and before to continue our discussions and dialogues, and we continue to do that in spinoffs. There's another spinoff that will take place actually on Saturday at the Kyoto Peace Conference. Members of the consortium presented a panel at the International Association of Genocide Scholars. So there are a number of different sort of things, and it's generative, it's not predetermined, and it depends on the interest of people. Anyway, so far it's been, the pandemic has been a bit of a bump, but we've sort of dealt with it in part by doing these spin-off events, spin-off discussions, which this is going to be. I don't want to go, so I want to talk briefly about a spinoff. I said when I was giving my presentation earlier about it can happen here in the state of the hate in the US. I talked about the catalyst. What I didn't really talk about was something that speaks to what the consortium is doing in terms of prevention. And I wanted to sink into that briefly to give you an example of sort of the types of things we do on the grounded local level. But in the US, of course, we have this myth of quote unquote American exceptionalism, manifest destiny. And you can see the cartoon on the right. That's not who we are. We always get this rhetoric. It recurs over and over again. So in terms of, how can you prevent mass violence, extremism, there are a number of different mechanisms, but I want to hone in on transitional justice and education. And, part of this is this reorientation of speaking that I mentioned before in relationship to what can happen here, about not looking at the events as an exception, but as a symptom of a long-term process. And in that, if you look at the history of the US, this is a very, I'm sure perhaps some of you have seen this, but if you look at the history of the US and you think of white power, white supremacy, it's linked. You can go back, of course, to 1492 and beyond, right? Because it's linked to global capitalism, neocolonialism. But even just within the sort of boundary of 1619 that's often used, you can see that, white power, white supremacy have been the predominant influence throughout US history and the settler colonial histories from which it emerged before that. And so we've seen, again, these sort of quote unquote exceptional events like George Floyd, but these aren't exceptional. These are events that have been taking place, for hundreds of years in different forms in the United States. The new word that sort of buzzed up in popular discourse, structural racism, systemic racism, has a number of different manifestations, but essentially because academics talked about these sorts of things, practitioners talked about these sorts of things, community members sometimes talked about some of these things, but it wasn't an everyday sort of discussion. So this term is now entered in, but it's a term that, again, relates back to this long history. Anyway, so I just want to conclude. My 5 minutes are almost up. So I had published at one point, again, as a sort of spinoff out of the consortium. So each person's been presenting about their research that ties into what they're bringing to the consortium. This is a little bit of what I've been doing. I wrote a op-ed calling for a truth commission on white supremacy, and it indirectly led to my participation as a jurist on this international tribunal on human rights abuses against Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples that just took place, as I mentioned in the earlier panel, from Friday until yesterday when a verdict was delivered. There were a number of different charges. I can bring up, I was originally going to read the first bit of the verdict, but I think because we don't have time, I won't do that. But the sort of charges that were brought forth, and this is a people's tribunal, so it's centered on the people's voices, and the idea is to move beyond formal legal structures that often are imbricated in structural racism and don't enable enough attention to be brought to bear on issues that are of concern and directly affect and disempower and subjugate even Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. So the sort of charges we looked at were police killings, mass incarceration, political prisoners, environmental racism, public health inequities, and genocide. And there are issues that aren't covered in there that were indirectly there that will probably be. So we produce a short verdict. There'll be a long verdict judgment that will be coming out at the end of the month. And I'm sure within the consortium, we will be discussing this. But the reason I bring it up is because sort of my participation in the consortium, this shows a trajectory of different things that sort of emerged out of it. Each of us has this sort of development resonance that's going on. And certainly the consortium has catalyzed my thinking. Earlier, we had Professor Mueller, had him talking about Canada and the Truth Commission. And of course, I showed the thing, my op-ed about the Truth Commission, and we plan to have discussions about that. We've talked about that. So, so very briefly, I wanted to talk about the overview of what the consortium is, the members, and then the sorts of things that are taking place, the larger conference and these different sorts of spin-offs that are taking place, educational initiatives. And I think other participants will speak to this in different ways. I will stop there and thank you for allowing me to share with you for a moment about that.
Okay, who is the next? I see Tali Nate.
Sure. Hello, and wonderful to be with you here from Johannesburg, South Africa. I look forward to listen to the recording of all the sessions that I missed. As Alex said, we come to the consortium from all around the world, and I come from, as a practitioner, I am the director of a Holocaust and Genocide Center. So I bring both what we do as a museum, as a center of education, a resource center, archive, and so on. But also we're involved in many publications, in other dialogues, conferences, and podcasts. And for example, I want to speak about one publication that came out now around issues of xenophobia and Afrophobia in South Africa, but also to chat to you a little bit, just for a few minutes, about the role of a museum in talking about painful histories of Holocaust and genocide in Africa, but making connections to issues of today. And of course, South Africa is placed in an interesting spot, as we, of course, emerge from a long history of colonialism, of racism, of apartheid, and we actually only 27 years after democracy. We are holding municipal elections on the 1st of November next week. And for the first time, we're predicting that in many of the major municipalities, Johannesburg, Pretoria, and many others, the ruling party, the African Congress, the ANC, the African National Congress, will lose their majority. There is prediction of only above 40% to the African National Congress, and with opposition parties getting the majority. We will see, because the prediction is also for very low turnout, which will be interesting. 27 years after fighting for the vote, if the voting will be less than 50%, it will be, of course, really interesting. So we are still facing in the country our past, which shape to a large extent the present and, of course, the future. And racism, hate speech, prejudice, abuse of power is affecting society today. We, as a Holocaust and Genocide Center, look at histories of the Holocaust, but also of genocide in Africa. We look at Namibia, the Herero and Nama genocide. We look at Rwanda, of course, the genocide there in 1994. But we look also beyond that. Armenia, Cambodia, current issues, Yazidi in the Yazidi genocide by IS, for example, or the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. So we do look beyond history to connecting to today. And the history of genocide is very much an entry point to reflect on ourselves. And one of the points that we reflect on ourselves is the issue of xenophobia and Afrophobia. Because we don't have much time, I'm going to share my screen and just show you a few images, very, very short. And I will want to just look at, this is us, welcome to our center. Our purpose and mission, you can explore that in our website. And as I said, we explore different issues of genocide. And specifically, I want to speak now in the 2-3 minutes that I have left about the issue of xenophobia and Afrophobia. We published a book this year. It's called Brother by photojournalists James Otway and Alon Sky. You can see the website of the book. I'm glad to say that the book is sold out, and we are actually publishing a second edition, a softcover second edition. And this is unusual, that a book about xenophobia in South Africa, a country that is suffering from this from 2008, where every year you have cases of murder and violence and burning. A book like that is sold out. So that is perhaps showing of the interest in NGOs and in civil society and amongst scholars, schools as well as universities of this subject. The book is of essays by leading journalists, voices from civil society, by Justice Edwin Cameron, that opens the book, by academics from the University of Wits and others. And it looks at images such as that. On the right-hand side, you have all the countries' names where refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants are coming to South Africa, but violence is exactly against the same civilians. And a picture like that, which look at a South African citizen that is showing his ID book, who is attacked for being non-South African and taking the jobs and taking the wives and taking the livelihood of South African. So I just wanted to briefly talk to you about that. You can see much more about it in the paper that I submitted, much more about it on our SoundCloud channel, and post in the chat a series that we are contributing again to the consortium. This series is a series called Sleepwalking Through the Assault on Democracy. At the moment, there are 4 chapters to that series: Dangerous Speech, Dangerous Women, Dangerous Religions, and Dangerous Medicine, with the next one, Dangerous Men, coming soon. And I'm glad that Alex Hinton will be on the panel next week with us and with others from other countries, looking also at fragility of democracy through hate speech and through hate and bigotry, but from the lens of fragile democracies. So I will stop here my very brief introduction to the work we do.
Спасибо большое, Tali.
Thank you so much, Tali. And saying that, I would like to pass the floor to Alexander Berkowski, Director of the SOVA Information Analytical Center, Radicalism and Xenophobia Monitoring Center. Thank you so much. I will speak Russian. Our center is called SOVA, S-O-V-A. We are dealing with extremism and hate crimes back from 2003, how to counter that. As a result, we are recognized as a foreign agent and have to announce that following the law. I'm going to speak about countering hate speech at online platforms. Actually, I would like to read a lecture, but I don't have time for that. So you're all familiar with these things, therefore, I will not speak about the problem at hand. It's obvious. There is a conflict, protection of different values, and the practice shows that a good solution, which would be suitable for everyone, at least for the majority, is not expected in the foreseeable future, meaning that everyone is dissatisfied with how it goes on. The society also doesn't have any consensus opinion as to how it may be done. And besides, we live in different societies, which has been said before, and therefore expectations from internet platforms are totally different. I'll try to be brief, and I'll try to come up with some positive recommendations. It must be admitted that in the EU, the principle of neutrality of internet platforms is buried, and everyone believes that there should be some limitations as what you may be allowed to say online. it only leaves to agree on that, and this agreement comes about, and we may see the rapprochement between the big platforms and the governments translated into the code of conduct signed and endorsed by the EU, following some framework decision of the EU. At the moment, the platforms, which account for 96% of the users, have endorsed this code of conduct. It doesn't resolve the problem, but at least it made us come closer to the solution. Certainly, authoritarian states are not approaching any resolution of that problem, but some civil society groups are dissatisfied with that. Let me speak about one more group. The group which we're members of, this is International Network Against Cyber Hate. And following the name, it deals exactly with countering cyber hate. In a recent report on the situation in the EU, the authors are complaining of the fact that the platforms, the networks, do not pay attention to the complaints from ordinary rank-and-file users, rather than the flagship users, which account only for 2%. But actually, the whole idea of this framework decision was to pay more attention to the complaints of the rank-and-file users. Certainly, the platforms are quite affluent and quite rich, but they are reluctant to increase their workforce. Half of the workforce of the big platforms are just screening off certain messages and content. Democratic countries not always are patient enough. For instance, Germany back in 2017 adopted a law on improvement of law enforcement in social media, empowering the administrations of these networks to keep track of the content, following 22 articles of the German Penal Code. Why this is bad? Because these bans, which were installed by the Penal Code or Criminal Code of Germany, is much broader than what's been enshrined in the EU legislation. And it lacks universal nature, and interpretation of the German law is delegated to the people who have nothing to do with Germany or with law. It's been criticized internationally, and in Russia, there was a very good article published on that topic. We can see how it's been used in practice. Let's have a look at YouTube report in the first 6 months, 2021. Almost 17,000 discriminatory or extremist statements were eliminated, and 14,000 appeals for violence following the German law. And usually, actually, the consultations took place in 24 cases. Such, actually, YouTube department has 24 members or officers, and none of them are lawyers. So their professions range from bricksmen, masons to don't know what. So what actually they are guided by when taking a decision what to eliminate and what to maintain? I do not know. We cannot say that that Germany penalized a lot the social media. Actually, only 7 lawsuits were satisfied out of 48. And actually, the overall amount of penalties and fines amounted to 30,000 euro. A similar draft law is now being considered by the French Parliament. So actually, the consensus opinion is very close, is rather close, but still there are some encroachments against such a consensus opinion, and certainly most of such encroachments are being made by Russia. Since this year, Russia has a law that whatever is to be blocked and frozen in Russia, not only the hate speech, has to be eliminated from the global platforms, and at the same time, actually, what is allowed on Russia should stay everywhere in the world. This is totally unrealistic, but this is the Russian-speaking social media of Kontakti has not endorsed this code of conduct, and therefore now actually it's very appealing for the rock actors. Therefore, I think that our way forward belongs to negotiations. We have to be more realistic in our expectations. The government of Germany, which case I described in every detail, tried to make sure that the platforms follow meticulously the requirements of the German legislation. And certainly this is totally unrealistic because of the big data and inflow of data which has to be filtered, which has to be screened. The administrators cannot keep track of that. In order to make this problem more realistic, we have to use two methods. First of all, we have to diminish the set of norms which violation would entail elimination of the content. Can you conclude? Give me 30 seconds more. And the code of conduct actually can be propagated beyond the EU. And secondly, we have to screen only that part of content which has some impressive or considerable audience. Therefore, it would decrease the scope of work. Unfortunately, we cannot eliminate the hate speech from the social media, just like we cannot eliminate that from our real life. But once we put forward some realistic goals, we can probably create certain normal environment where this propaganda will not be done systemically. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I forgot to say that Alexander is also member of the Human Rights Center under the President of the Russian Federation. That's a very arbitrary question which was raised, because I remember my work for the Civil Society Federation work, when every day I would be exchanging letters with the General Prosecutor's Office regarding vandalism, etc., against the Jewish cemeteries, and we insisted that actually we have to introduce a list of extremist literature, and when it was done, end of the day, immediately the statistics changed, and we saw the drop in anti-Semitist sentiment.
Well, this conflict is always there. You cannot get away from it. And we continue. The next one is probably going to be Steve. Are you prepared to say something? Yes or no?
Microphone, please.
Okay, there we are. Well, the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue, which I founded with Eric Gozlan, is committed to three different things. One, it's committed to education. And to that end, we've put on, I would say since over the last few years, about 24 conferences of one sort or another. Two, we have engaged in the extension of human rights. Eric, for example, has been deeply involved with, excuse me, Guinea, and we are currently engaged in an action to try and liberate a few hundred women from Yemeni jails where they are being genuinely brutalized. And finally, we will also be building an African, or helping build an African human rights center with the help of the Guineans and certain other African groups. And finally, we are concerned with conflict resolution, which Valerie is particularly involved in Eastern Europe, along with Igor Cutler. Valerie has opened a branch of ICDD in Latvia, and Igor has just now, literally a few days ago, received the go-ahead to open a branch of ICDD in the United States. What we try and do is emphasize against extremism of any sort. We seek to unify what are often conflicting elements of civil society, either within particular countries or between particular countries. And that is a complicated undertaking. But we feel this is the way to begin talking about civic diplomacy, which I should also say we're involved in. Usually the way things go is that there are contacts made between staffers or medium-level politicians, and then it goes, then the desire for resolution goes upward. We believe instead, though it's more complicated and expensive, that this produces the kind of legitimation crisis around treaties and agreements that alienates the public. And so our concern is to start with civil society as so that the people in each nation have a common voice with which to express their concerns. We hope that you check out our organization. It is indeed cosmopolitan in theory and practice. And join us in some of our ventures. Perhaps Eric has a few other things to say.
Hi, everyone. So for ICDD, no, I don't have. Yes, we try to work with civil society because, and that can be my conclusion of this symposium. So it was a very good symposium because we saw that over the world we have the same problems with extremism and radicalism. We have the same fight, but the problem that after the diagnostic we have to give solution, and for me the solution can come only through the civil society and the association, which work in all the association, they work really on the field. And it's very interesting to hear them because they know really what people are thinking and why people start to be extremists, for example, in Europe. And I hope that next time we can organize another symposium about what the NGOs want, what the association can, what did they found as a solution. Okay, that's enough for me.
Спасибо большое, Эрик.
Thank you very much, Eric. Dear colleagues, please, we have some time to express ourselves sometime before we are to close this event and discuss some of the matters that we discussed throughout the day today. Any volunteers who would want to say anything right now? May I? Yes. Valery, I'm sorry, but I simply, Alexander, but maybe of those who haven't spoken yet, of course. Mark Park, did you want to say anything?
Something, Mark, I understand wrong.
Well, I don't have an organization to talk about at all, but I just thought a small point I think is interesting, maybe more so in the American context than in other contexts. But, it is the debate essentially between what I would characterize as quarantine versus inoculation. I'm talking about responses to hate groups and their propaganda. It is a true fact that in the 1950s and 1960s, when we began to see the first kind of post-war fascist formations in the United States, groups like the American Nazi Party appeared, very small groups at the time. What happened in response to the appearance of those groups, and in particular the American Nazi Party, is that a number of Jewish groups devised a policy they called the quarantine policy. And what they did was they went around to, for instance, the owners of television stations or the owners of newspapers or the editors and chiefs of newspapers in particular cities and said things like, they go to the Washington Post or the television stations in Washington, D.C. And say, don't cover the American Nazi Party. It's nothing. It's 12 people marching around in a circle waving swastikas. Why give them the attention? And in fact, in the 50s and 60s, and even into the late 60s, that was a pretty successful policy. Very many media company owners agreed, yeah, why should we cover these crazy people? We won't run a story on them, even though there were 12 American Nazi Party stormtroopers marching around, in downtown Washington yesterday, or whatever it may be. My real point here is that the world has changed in such a way that that is not possible anymore. The idea of some kind of walling off this speech that we may not like, or locking people into rooms where no one can hear them. And the reason for that, of course, is the development of the internet, the development of cable television, of talk radio, of social media in general, right? There are these enormous numbers of ways that people receive information. So it may be that the New York Times or the NBC News refuses to cover a certain event or a certain claim that is being made, but there's no way that can keep that information away from people in general, right? They'll get it on cable news, they'll get it in their feeds on Facebook, in any number of ways. So my bottom line point here is that for practitioners, people who are trying to battle this kind of information, these conspiracy theories, these false claims about certain groups, certain disliked groups, is inoculation. In other words, they must be confronted directly. So, when whatever it may be, right? When the governor of Texas says that there's a secret plan on the part of the federal government, to impose martial law in Texas, that governor has to be confronted directly with the absolute falsehood of those claims. We're obviously in the middle of a similar battle around vaccines in this country, vaccines and vaccine efficiency, whether it's really a secret plan by the government to control all of us and so on. So what I'm arguing for is that, hiding the speech, I'm not speaking out against deplatforming. I think that's fine. These are private organizations. They have every right to kick people off their platforms. But I'm suggesting that merely, putting a cork in people's mouth, merely refusing to allow certain people to say certain things in certain venues is not a complete answer to the question, to the problem at all. The lies, the hypocrisy, the demonizing that is, central to this movement, to the radical right that we're talking about, is something that has to be confronted directly. I think of the woman who wrote Lying About the Holocaust. And, what she said at the beginning of her book was, this was the last book she wanted to write because, obviously everyone knows the Holocaust occurred, but it's no longer so obvious to very large numbers of people. Tens of millions of people have actually swallowed the idea that, it's a made up story and so on. And so, again, as distasteful as it may be, I think it is up to all of us, academics as well as practitioners out there in the world, to take on these falsehoods and confront them directly. If you have a Lou Dobbs on your television screen in your country, that person's lies must be confronted directly. The alternative is, those ideas get out into the mainstream more and more and more, are accepted by large numbers of people, and some subset of those people engage in criminal violence and even terrorism. So anyway, that's just a thought for all of us.
Спасибо большое, Марк.
Thank you very much, Mark. I see that Adam Mueller needs to speak. Please have the floor.
Thanks, Valerie. I really appreciate it. So I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points, particularly Mark's point about deplatforming and context. I mean, he rightly says that deplatforming isn't a complete solution to the problem of hate and hate speech. That's absolutely correct, but it's at least partly correct, because when we talk about hate speech or right-wing hate speech even, we're not talking about one thing. We're talking about different things. And this reminds me, like with regard to deplatforming, I think, certainly in academic context and as a genocide scholar concerned with the toxic qualities of genocide denialism, I'm not always prepared to entertain discussions about the existence or not of the Holocaust, partly because within academic context, it just lacks the kind of prima facie respectability as an opinion that guarantees I will attend to it in a respectful way. I feel entirely entitled to reject or deplatform any Holocaust denier simply because they lack the requisite kinds of competence to be a reasonable interlocutor in critical discussions of what the Holocaust was and what its legacies are. That said, I want to return to a point made in an earlier session by Stephen Bronner, which I think is an important point, and it's slightly inflammatory. Maybe my way of putting it will be both balder and more sort of obnoxious than Stephen's. Stephen made a very delicate, nice way. But his point was really about a gap between, and it's a standard gap between theory and practice, and particularly the need of practitioners to attend more to theory. I think two things are true. One, we need more theory, right? And I say that as a theorist, but somebody who's sort of tired of the kind of untidiness of a lot of our thinking about what, for example, the kind of globular qualities, I guess, to our thinking about what right-wing hate is, right? And I think practitioners need to attend to this, because unless we understand what the problem is in a kind of fine-grained enough way, we're not going to opt for solutions that are targeted enough to do the work we need them to do. So with regard to the Canadian context, one of the things I just wanted to say about my own thinking about this, partly to float a balloon, right, and see what you think. But I think that we need to, at least in the Canadian context, which is a multicultural context where you have people arriving from different parts of the world with their own baggage, settling in, and then being acculturated in different ways, I think we have room to acknowledge at least three different kinds of hate and hate speech. First of all, and I will distinguish between them as follows. One is I'm calling local hate. Secondly, I'm calling something diasporic hate. And thirdly, I talk about xenophobic hate. And each of those is operative within the Canadian context. They overlap at their edges, so they're not discrete phenomena. These are ideal types, right? So we know that in actual fact, they're messier and cross-contaminating. But at the end of the day, when we talk about local hate, we talk about insider hate, hate by groups of people who recognize or acknowledge themselves, think of themselves as insiders, and are responding to historical patterns of hate and prejudice. So in the Canadian context, this would include, for example, Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations that manifest in local expressions of hate that would be quite strange, perhaps, to people not Canadian, but these would include things like starlight tours, where the police take Indigenous people and dump them in the middle of winter on the edge of town. And many Indigenous people have died through these starlight tours. So they picked up their alcoholic, they get taken out to the edge of town, just left there. Also, debates about Indigenous genocide and whether there was a genocide, whether it was just cultural genocide, so forth, that also expresses it. And I think to also historically anti-Black racism in Canada with respect to the settlement of first slaves and then freedmen in places like Halifax, where they comprised communities like Africville that were later destroyed for, again, racist reasons. These are internal manifestations or expressions of internal hate as opposed to diasporic hate, where people are bringing the terms of a conflict from outside and re-embedding them, relocating them in the Canadian context. This would include friction between Canada's Ukrainian and Jewish community, between the communities of Ukrainians and Russians in Canada, and of course, between members of the Rwandan community, other diasporic communities that are channeling prior conflicts or conflicts from away into the Canadian social political landscape. And then finally, xenophobic hate is just simply sort of response by Canadians to people they perceive as outsiders with a view to keeping them out. We see this historically in the form of anti-Asian hate directed against Chinese railway workers. We see this in the confiscation and internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II, and we see this in contemporary refugee discussions. Unless we acknowledge these as different kinds of prejudice and hate, then we're going to look for one-size-fits-all solutions that aren't going to be subtle enough to actually target the springs of this particular discriminatory outlook or these outlooks. I just wanted to say that.
Большое спасибо, Татьяна Станиславовна.
Thank you. Did Tatiana want to say something? No. Alexander? No? And then I would like to give the floor to Alexander Berkowski again. Yes, just for a couple of comments extra regarding what kind of taboos we need here, what kind of prohibitions we need here. It's probably an old argument we've had with Valery for a long time. I'm the proponent of the European concept of fighting extremism and xenophobia, rather than the American one. And I believe that countering any kind of form of radicalism should be focused by the law enforcement on the most dangerous manifestations of that, because law enforcement may not have enough capacity to focus on everything. The idea that we can prosecute expression of thought is the prevention of violence, is the analog of the police theory of broken windows, but this analog doesn't work. And we can say that with certainty, using the Russian example. Russian violence in our cities started falling in the early 2010 in parallel with how the number of prosecutions for racist manifestations was growing. The number started falling with the fall of number of hate speech cases, but violence is dependent on countering that violence, and that's countering has been quite successful. I'm not against prosecuting for racist expressions, but the scale of these activities should be commensurate with the danger, should be reasonable. What is happening often is not reasonable, and we've spoken about this today. Thank you very much, Alexander. I don't quite agree with you. I have been following these stats. Indeed, so this number started falling when they started putting people in prison for expression of racism. And as the number grew, the safer our society was going. But when they stopped prosecuting for that, that happened in about 2018 in December, they liberalized Article 282 of the Criminal Code. There was a little spike after that, and then everything started sliding down. Why? First of all, because the liberalization was notional, mostly. Administrative punishment was only offered for the first instance of this crime, and then this would be followed by criminal punishment. But people saw that the state is serious about this and is not going to turn a blind eye to that. And I think that was what was the driving force in Russia. And that played a very important role back then. But we will see some growth, and there will be some kickback, so to speak. And I see some dependence there. But this has been a long argument of ours. There's no need to propagate it and repeat it for the 10th time. But I guess we'll stay with our opinion. Mr. Rostokinsky, did you have something to add? Yes, I just didn't have the time to press the microphone to unmute it. I wanted to support Alexander. I don't see the patronymic of his, but I'm using your stats when I'm writing my research papers. I'm talking about the SOVA's research. I wanted to support you about speech hate. Article 282 of the Criminal Code was decriminalized, at least its first part, and they did it properly because it was too subjective and a lot was left to the discretion of the law enforcers. And I think that's a good thing. At the beginning of my first presentation, I spoke, and not fortuitously so, that the Shanghai Convention and the resolutions that were introduced spoke about two things: violence and the incitement of violence. And therefore, Article 270 works here. Incitement is something we should focus on and reform the criminal code in such a way that any incitement for any crime, any kind of crime, we don't need to be very discreet about this. Any incitement should be criminally punished because this causal nature brings a certain lack of system to the criminal code and its application. And as for Article 282, I think that article has played its role, and now, if we pay the attention, there is Article 129 in the Criminal Code of German Criminal Code. It's about bullying certain groups of people. It's about discrimination, and it covers essentially all of our extremist punishments and bans. And maybe that's the experience we could copy. And in that sense, we will optimize our law. Because in practice, I can see that quite often people are prosecuted without real reason for just the expression of their thought. And they are not extremist expressions, but subjectivity permits that to happen. And as for the way such crimes are evaluated, this is far from being perfect, and that also contributes to people being unlawfully imprisoned. And a few other words in support of the previous speaker about the fact that we have a gap between practice and theory. It is indeed so. As a forensic expert, as a criminologist, I would like to point out that criminology is a smart science, and it gives us very good forecasts, but nobody needs this. Nobody needs these forecasts. Nobody's listening to them in that sense. And that's the failure of our legislators. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alexander. I agree with what you've said regarding the delegation of the right to make a decision to the law enforcers. And I think that is something that is fraught with danger. Steve Bronner, you wanted to say something in a couple of minutes. Please, go ahead.
But please, microphone, Steve. Steve, microphone. Okay. No. You didn't turn it on. Okay.
I appreciate very much what Alexander said, but I'd like to take it in a slightly different way. It's almost like I'd like to take it in a less quantifiable way, direction. I've seen too often where progressive people celebrate the suppression of right-wing speech. This is not only true of cancel culture, it's true of cancel culture. It's true, I think, even of the most well-meaning among them. But by the same token, I've heard too much about the difference between canceling culture or suppression from the standpoint of the left and the right. So, for example, any number of my friends, when Samuel Paty was killed in France, said, well, you know, he should have been more aware of the people he was insulting. And after all, these are the subaltern who have to, not those who have it, control the dominant discourse. I think we have to be really hard line on this, that whenever some kind of suppression of free speech takes place, this is in a certain way a defeat for progressive thinking, not a victory. And we should see this as, well, put it this way, as temporary as possible, and not as a virtue, but exactly the opposite. Just my thoughts.
Окей, коллеги, спасибо большое. Нам
Okay,
уже-
thank you very much, colleagues. It's time for us to wrap it up. I wanted to thank the Gorchakov Public Diplomacy Fund for the opportunity, the funds and the technical opportunity to have this event. I would like to thank all of the participants for this. And in fact, we've done an important thing. For 7 hours, we have been talking about a common problem that worries us. We may have a difference of opinion, different models for extremism, and different approaches to tackling extremism. And we could say that indeed there is a conflict between democracy and security interests. And this conflict is getting deeper. But there is a problem that exists, the problem of delegating decisions on extremism to law enforcers from the legislators. This is an inevitable problem because the stricter we get, the closer we get to the European model, the clearer this issue comes to the fore. And I'd like to say that this is all true, but the important thing is that we are talking about this, we are discussing this, and we need to do that. And the fact that the experts community gathered here at this platform, at this virtual forum here in Moscow, as part of our Center for Studying Extremism and Radicalism at the Institute here in Moscow, this is an indication that these meetings should become more regular so that we could discuss what's going on and discuss new nuances that arise in the public discourse regarding extremism and xenophobia and extremism. I think we've done a great thing, and we want to publish our proceedings, a set of presentations, and I would like everyone to send us your texts.
It takes time in order to edit that, and probably we'll translate that into different languages, but we plan to publish as soon as possible the results of our today's work. I don't think that we did a big work from the scientific standpoint, so that it could take some material shape, some tangible shape. Once again, thank you so much to everyone, and I do hope to see you soon. Thank you so much, and bye.
Bye-bye.
Спасибо всем, коллеги. До свидания.
До свидания.